let's break down the last 24 hours of Donald Trump commentary about the war in Ukraine and the recent trip to Saudi Arabia, where American and Russian officials engaged in direct negotiations, including Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States, and Sergei Lavrov, without the presence of Ukraine. So there was the previous phone call without the presence of the Ukrainians, and this is another meeting between the Russians and the United States without the presence of the Ukrainians again. Now, this was not received well in Kiev, amongst parts of the population, but also amongst the government, of course, but has been followed up with a string of just, all I could say is the most unquaint and Neanderthal window-licking type-esque vibe, I don't know how to define it, commentary about the war and its causes that I've seen from Trump. Let me read some of this to you. So in the last 24 hours, we're just going to go through a bunch because I can't get every clip because there's so many different ones. So we're just going to read some quotes, and then we're going to look at some clips. Here's the first quote. This is Trump towards Zelensky. This is Trump about Zelensky. You should have never started the war. As in the Ukrainians started the war. He followed this up with this idea that the Ukrainians shouldn't have started this by saying that the Ukrainians could have avoided this if they just gave more land to the Russians.
Disappointed. I hear that, they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this.
Half-baked negotiator could have
years ago, without the loss of much land, very little land.
Without the loss of much land, very little land.
Without the loss of any lives, and without the loss of cities that are just laying on their sides. You have
without the loss of cities that are laying on their side. So any type of negotiator could have solved this. So he's saying that the Biden team could have solved this to negotiate, but failed to because they were just so bad. And then everybody else previously could have, but they were just so bad. Presumably, Trump could have during his first term in office, but didn't because, the war was continuing to go on. People were dying. Avdiivka was attacked in 2017 while Trump was in office. It just wasn't getting the headlines. But just because the mainstream media was not covering it does not mean it wasn't happening. And it was. Why didn't he do it the first time around? And if that is the case, Trump said he was going to solve it in 24 hours. Tim Pool said -2 months, but Trump said 24. It has been well over going to 600, 700, going on 800 hours. 24 hours didn't happen. If any half-baked negotiator could have done it, why haven't you done it yet? And now that you're starting to run into road bumps with the Europeans and road bumps with the Ukrainians, and the way that you're progressing, before the negotiations have started, mind you, he's saying any half-baked negotiator could do it. And the things that Trump has conceded so far before negotiations have started is Ukrainian NATO membership, Ukrainian territory, American troops in NATO, and now we're hearing that they're also going to request the Ukrainians host an election. Now, mind you, once the war is over and the state of emergency is undeclared, the Ukrainians are going to have to hold an election. The reason they're not holding an election is because the Ukrainian constitution states that when a state of emergency is declared, like getting invaded in a situation where you would declare a state of emergency, elections are suspended. Now, they want to have elections right when this deal is made. Now, if the war is over, it shouldn't be an issue. And I guess you could concede that, quote unquote. But if it's a ceasefire and not a peace deal, and then the Russians are going to invade again in 1 or 2 years, or they could invade again literally in a year, or they could try to destabilize the election while trying to prepare for another invasion. The election could just be a weak point for the Russians to attack, and hosting an election during the war is certainly out of the question due to the amount of people that are displaced, the amount of people in occupied territory, and the fact that a bunch of stacked polling lines across the country could be targeted, and that's going to terrify Ukrainian officials. And so these are like all these concessions, concession after concession after concession after concession is being made. We have Marco Rubio, we're going to check it out in a bit, talking about lifting sanctions off of Russia post-war and about bringing the Europeans to the table, not to assert the Ukrainian position, not bringing the Europeans to the table to add to Ukrainian leverage, which has not been stated at all, but so that they could also remove their sanctions off the Russians as well. So the Americans and the Europeans could remove their sanctions. And like using that as a piece of leverage to get something could be useful, but we've given all these concessions, got nothing in return, and negotiations aren't even underway yet. I don't think people realize that. The negotiations haven't started. What they're doing right now is setting the groundwork for negotiations to begin, and they're like probing at possible pathways for where that negotiation could be built upon. What terms would be necessary in order to make the Russians come to the table? What are the Americans going to be happy enough with? Now the Ukrainians aren't at the table yet. They're getting like told things after the fact. They have a meeting, then they tell the Ukrainians. They have a meeting, then they tell the Ukrainians, which I don't think is a recipe for success, and it's not a way to get the Russians to respect the Ukrainians as their neighbor, as a sovereign nation state that they cannot invade and conquer. But that's not how Trump sees it anyway, so I don't think he really cares much about that. Anyway, Trump is out there swinging from the fences, trying to justify all this behavior. And one way he did that was by suggesting that Zelensky is terribly, terribly unpopular in Ukraine, and so there needs to be elections. And in fact, Zelensky has and this is the number he used, a 4% approval rating. Now, if Zelensky had a 4% approval rating, not only would Zelensky be unpopular, Zelensky would be the most unpopular leader on the planet. And possibly, I mean, definitely one of the most unpopular ones in history. I don't know, you're going to have to find somebody that's pulling at 3%, 2%. Like, can you even get the guy's neighbors to like him? His family. I mean, he's polling worse than Jeffrey Epstein in these numbers. And so it's very hard to understand where you get these numbers from, because the numbers that I see has Zelensky at 52%, 54%. Basically, the lowest numbers I can find for Zelensky has him at a slim majority. Now, you could say that actually in and of itself has political implications for Zelensky, because he used to be at the start of the war in the high 80s, and then it went down to the 70s, and now it's down to the 50s. And you could say, oh, there's like an implication there. But the majority of Ukrainians through 3 years continue to be have an approval rating of him that's positive, and a strong majority of Ukrainians want to continue to see him as the leader of Ukraine till the end of the war. And so not only is that viewpoint not taken into consideration by Trump, but this like approval rating number is just completely made up. Now, whether or not Donald Trump literally manufactured this number out of thin air and just threw it out there randomly in order to justify it in the moment, or, you know, this is something that Sergei Lavrov told him, or something that Tulsi Gabbard now confirmed gave him in an intelligence briefing. Like, I have no clue how this information gets into his ear. He's a president of the United States. His attention is worth so much. And somehow it got to this number, and he's throwing it at people. And he's the president of the United States. People listen to what he has to say. This is nonsense. When he throws out like aid numbers out there just out of thin air, it's complete nonsense. I don't know if you guys saw, but he said recently, and do I have the quote somewhere? I might have the quote somewhere, but it was, we've given Ukraine $350 billion or something. I don't know. Here is the $110 billion worth of aid, which is, you know, less than 1/3 of what Donald Trump said, that has actually made its way over to like Ukraine. And by the way, a lot of this isn't like even like, hey, this is Ukraine. It's, hey, this is actually related to U.S. troops in Europe. So technically, it's not like aid directly to Ukraine, but it's related to the issue, so it's appropriated. And there's other funds that you could say, you know, went to for example, manufacturing depots in the United States, but that would be with the 170 number, not the 110 billion. Either way, though, there's no math that gets to 350, which is $50 billion more than the number he just said yesterday. So did he just did $50 billion just appear in Ukraine overnight? Or did he just decide, oh, that number I threw out yesterday, 300 billion, that wasn't a good enough lie. We didn't make the Ukrainian look like leeches enough. So how about we add just another 50 billion that didn't exist? While 3.8 billion in aid just sits there not moving in the Presidential Drawdown Authority. Thank you for the 2 New Zealand dollars from Conrad King. When is Trump getting the Sharpie out on the map? It's about time he did that. It is about time he did that. Here's another thing Trump said. He said Russia did not want to destroy Kiev. No, they didn't want to destroy Kiev. If they would have done it. Basically, he's saying that it's not that the Russians failed to destroy Kiev. It's that the Russians could have destroyed Kiev, but have made the conscious decision not to, either out of the goodness of their hearts, their loveness, and their belief in the brotherly peoples, or maybe it was so out of some strategic necessity that overlapped with humanitarian concerns. And what a crock of shit. Look at Bakhmut. Look at Popasna. Look at the locations in Kiev that has been hit by them, whether it's the children's cancer wards and hospitals or the residential buildings. It's not that they can and have decided not to. It's that they have a limited amount of missiles, rockets, and munitions. And if they took everything they had and threw it at Kiev, they wouldn't have enough to strain Ukraine's air defense systems across the whole country. They wouldn't have enough to pressure the manufacturing depots that are in western Ukraine, or they wouldn't have enough to terrorize Kharkiv or Odessa or Ivano-Frankivsk or wherever it could be. Kherson, Mykolaiv. Even though in Kherson, they'll typically just terrify them with drones hunting the local babushkas. My goodness. I just listened to Trump's comments. Trump said you should have never started the war, but he did not say that Ukraine started the war. You should have never started the war. Okay, what does that mean? What is that? No. Okay, that's a distinction without a difference. If I said, if I say to Billy Bob, you should have never started this problem, right? I said you should have never started this problem. Well, you didn't say Billy Bob should have started. No, I said you should have never started this problem. It's a distinction without a difference. He's placing the blame at the feet of Ukraine, and that blame amounts to, why didn't Ukraine just concede land? And what would have happened if Ukraine conceded land? Let's say at the start of 2022, after losing Crimea, after losing the city of Donetsk, after losing large parts of Luhansk, they just said, fine, we're going to give you the rest of Donetsk. So we're going to evacuate all these people from Kramatorsk. We're going to evacuate all these people from Slovyansk. We're going to evacuate all these people out of Konstantinivka and Toretsk. And we're going to move all these people out. And these are now Russian cities. And you get to own them. And you'll annex them. And we'll recognize it. Then what? What has been accomplished? Well, let's say that while not addressing the issue of NATO deployments in the Baltics, which is something that Putin brought to the attention of the Biden administration, while not addressing the issue of NATO expansion into Ukraine. But I guess you could also put that cherry on the top and negotiate away that land as well as Ukrainian NATO membership. Maybe you kick the can down the road. Maybe you stop an immediate invasion. But what happens when that demand expands to, Odessa's been a Russian city? Well, Kharkiv's been a Russian city. Well, even if we control this land, Ukraine still is not submitting to our economic demands. I remember when they did the pipe freeze back in the mid-2000s. Back in, 2008, 2009, something like that. Or the economic coercion that preceded the Euromaidan protests. The idea that if we just gave them a little bit more land, and we just said that for sure there'd be no American Marines ready to march into Moscow through over the border from Sumy, then they'll be satisfied. I find this naive. I find this incredibly naive. Donald Trump, all he has to do is listen to Putin's lips or read his writing, where he says that Ukraine can only exist in two states, and that is as an extension of the Russian Federation, or not at all. That means being absorbed into the Russian Federation. And so if you pull back, leave the issue to the Europeans, and expect like Ukraine to just concede this land and, oh, that'll be enough, the Russians will push for more, just like they did after 2014, just like they did after Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, and just like they're doing again. Like, it just, I don't know what you expect. I don't know what you expect. But they expect something, because Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov met in Riyadh to talk. And the reaction to this, I mostly had, because I saw two reactions to this, and we'll start with my reaction, and then we'll start to the other reaction. My reaction was, oh my God, look at this room, and look at who they have here to negotiate. Because we, of course, all this information is going back to Trump, not good. Trump's getting intelligence briefings from Tulsi Gabbard on this, not good. Trump has people like J.D. Vance and RFK that could whisper in his ear, and Elon Musk, a big financier, all people who either, I think, are not, either have bad positions on the war in Ukraine, or just plain old misinformed or lie about it constantly. Keith Kellogg is,
after all that's happened
who knows?
recently, maybe Skynet was onto something with that whole wiping out humanity idea.
Thank you so much for that, dollars. Appreciate that, Frosty. And Keith Kellogg is somewhere advocating for some amount of leverage in negotiations, but as he negotiates to retain leverage, Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, was determined to give it up, with Trump backing him up in public statements afterwards, because neither of them have experience in negotiations. And that's the thing you find here. Look at the Russian negotiating team, okay? Yuri Yashokov, the Kremlin's chief foreign policy advisor. He's worked in diplomacy for over half a century. Sergei Narshikin, he's his top spy, and he served alongside Putin in the KGB. So this is somebody who's worked with Putin since the time he was an agent for the Soviet Union. Kirill Dmitriev, a financier educated at Stanford and Harvard, who has ties to the Kremlin's chief family, and according to the publication, could play a key role as an unofficial back channel to Trump's negotiators. A rumor says that Vladimir Medinsky is to join the Russian team in Riyadh. He is a former minister of culture. Now he is Putin's key advisor on ideological aspects of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. You want to know something that I noticed about all this? Want to know something I noticed by a lot of this? You see experience. You see top advisors who have worked in politics for like decades. You see people who are well experienced in Putin's way of doing foreign policy. These are not newbies. These are people that Putin have used around him to sharpen his credentials, sharpen his tongue as he goes around the world, taking a little piece of this and a little piece of that. And now they're taking the cream of the crop of negotiators and manipulators and fluffers, and they're sending that over to Riyadh. And we've got little Marco, Mike Waltz. Okay, Mike Waltz is something. But once these offers are brought back to Trump, and Trump's got Tulsi there, Trump's got RFK there, Trump's got J.D. Vance there, maybe like Elbridge Colby, he just wants to bring them over to China as quickly as possible. He's got Elon Musk there, his eunuch whispering in his ear like worm tongue. And then he said, like, well, I mean, we don't want to do NATO membership anyway, so let's just give it up out of the gate. Well, we don't want to have troops in there anyway, so let's just say we're not going to have troops in there to get this stuff started. Giving this up before negotiations start. Giving up your leverage before they put what's on the table and have made negotiation demands in negotiations. Like this is stuff that you would expect to be in a book titled, say, Art of the Deal. But it's not. And another thing that I really didn't like about this is this message, and I wanted to bring this up earlier, but I just remembered it. This message of, Oh, there's upset Ukrainians that want a seat at the table. They've had a seat at the table for 3 years. What does that mean? Russia invades them. The Russians then refuse to make any reasonable concessions for 3 years. And then you come in, and maybe you're willing to make unreasonable concessions. And you say, oh, well, the Ukrainians could have done this. The Ukrainians could have conceded. There was no negotiation process like this. What do you mean they were at the table for 3 years? There was no table. There was no table. No one put up the table because neither side could come to terms. The idea that they've had so many opportunities to make peace, so fuck them. They don't need to be here. The Ukrainians don't need to be here when determining the future of the country. This is how you get the Ukrainians to walk away. And I want to emphasize this as well. The Ukrainians have the ability to walk away. The Ukrainians can't just say no. They can just say no. And while it could be a worse outcome for them when it comes to military aid, if the Ukrainian government is put in a position where the vast majority of the people are unwilling to accept, for example, like seceding Kherson, or say no long-term security guarantees, or some sort of troop limitation on Ukrainian force, or some sort of terms that they're not willing to accept, it's not as simple as Zelensky just says, okay, this is the way it's going to go. Not only are the Ukrainian people quite rowdy when it comes to doing things that doesn't align with what they think is in the national interest, but also Ukraine has a parliament. They have a Rada. If you were to propose this peace deal, go away from the emergency declaration, declare peace, and recognize any territorial shifts, you need to get approval from the Ukrainian Rada constitutionally. So it's not just as simple as like, oh, can we just strong arm this one TV star, Zelensky, who's been hardened by a lot of years of war now? It's a question of you're going to have to do that to a lot of Ukrainian society and also the Ukrainian parliament, which is going to be a lot more difficult. And there's a lot of, and eventually if you push too hard, they might just throw their hands up and say, we'll go it with Europe. And it is a security priority for the Europeans. I mean, the Europeans cannot allow the Russians to conquer Europe. But the Ukrainian government cannot allow a foreign government to either divide it against itself by making it accept terms that its people see as so unjust as unlivable, or instead of dividing it against itself, undercutting long-term success by making it so that it can't have the resources that it controls or the wealth due to payments to the United States in order to rebuild the damage, to show a thriving, flourishing society in comparison to Moscow and what's over the border. But Marco Rubio took the opportunity after this Riyadh visit to say that they want to, America, as representatives of America, they want to, quote unquote, take advantage of the incredible opportunity to partner with the Russians geopolitically on issues of common interest and economically. They even floated the idea of removing sanctions at the conclusion of the war. And look, if there is a long-term peace deal that can guarantee the Russians do not invade again, and the issue of territory has been finally settled, then maybe you can start a discussion about sanctions. If it's anything besides that, you cannot have that discussion. My goodness. Now, the other way people covered it besides mine, which was fear from the experience that a lot of these Trump picks are going to have to be facing down, and Trump's going to be having to deal with. The other reaction to it was, wow, Zelensky refused the mineral deal last week. Well, isn't it interesting that now they're proposing to hold elections? And isn't it also interesting that Zelensky is not in Riyadh and he canceled his trip there? Oh my gosh. Maybe this is in relation to the fact that they want to force him to hold elections, and he knows because of what Trump said and otherwise that he'd totally lose and such and such. Maybe he'd lose, maybe he'd win. But first things first, the Saudis wanted the Ukrainians at the talks. but the US and Russia said no. So what was Zelensky supposed to do? I'm going to go and I'm going to purposely try to piss off one of our main beneficiaries in this war, the United States, by going to this talks when I'm not welcome. So he didn't go. The only meeting that he was possibly going to end up having, even though the Saudis were like, this doesn't make any sense. This is a peace talk about Ukraine and Russia. When Americans say they want a Ukraine-Russia peace deal, they mean a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, negotiated between Ukraine and Russia, not negotiated by a bunch of people, then forced upon Ukraine and then strong-arming them. And the Saudis, I mean, are even like, come on, why aren't they at the table? But yeah, if you're not wanted at the table, you're not going to be at the table. But then we're going to criticize them for, like, doing what we asked them for. Like, oh, I bet it was because he was hiding from elections. There will be elections once the war is over. There will be, certainly. There are people who want to compete with Zelensky. Do not use the fact that the Constitution suspends elections to just fall into the viewpoint that is comfortable for you, which is, oh, the reason Zelensky's mad right now is because he wants to have power forever. And it's not, he is being forced into terms that he doesn't think is beneficial for his state. That is not what he thinks is secure for them in the long term. Making concessions that his people do not want to make. Like, which is the much more likely scenario. No, it's because of the elections. The only way you can negotiate against Ukraine, it seems, in the public sphere, and get attention is by being cartoonish in your interpretation of Ukrainian intentions and Zelensky's intentions. Seems to be the only way. Also, another thing I thought was funny from Sagar. Look at this thing. I wonder why Zelensky doesn't want elections. Over 50% of Ukrainians want to end the war. Whoa! And see, what's supposed to be implied here, over 50% of Ukrainians want to end a war. Zelensky hasn't ended the war. So if there's elections, they're going to elect Mr. Peace in Ukraine, and then he's going to end the war. Okay, now, number one, on its face, this is flawed, because somebody can both support Zelensky, want to end the war, but be like, you know, right now I don't know if conditions are right for the et cetera, but I want to end it. But look at the byline here. 52% of those who want a negotiated peace also support territorial concessions. 52% of those who want a negotiated peace. So 52% of 50% of Ukrainians. So a quarter of Ukrainians support territorial concessions. Well,
Burns is an
that
immoral,
doesn't seem like a majority.
corrupt, bankrupt man.
Okay, now let's break that down further. Territorial concessions. What sort of territorial concessions? Because the poll just says territorial concessions. And so for one person who lives in, say, Mariupol, they could think, okay, we let them have Crimea, and then I get to go back to my home in Mariupol. Somebody who might be from Donetsk might be like, okay, you get Crimea, and we get to go back to our home in Donetsk. Somebody from Mariupol might be like, okay, you get Crimea, and then I get to go back to my home in Mariupol and reopen my church. Because the Russians shot down a ton of churches in Mariupol. But that's not what I think the Russians are putting to the table. The Russians are putting to the table, let us control everything we have and more, and everything we announced annexing. Which I don't think a quarter of Ukrainians would support that. I would be surprised if half of a quarter of Ukrainians support that. If you can get 1 in 10 Ukrainians to support that, I would be at least slightly surprised. But that's far from, wow, all the Ukrainians want to just give up all the land and end it right away on Russian terms because the violence is so overwhelming that they'll give up their homes and their civil society or etc. This is just, all he had to do was read the byline. I wonder why Zelensky doesn't want elections. I wonder why Sagar didn't pay attention to math class. My goodness. And you know, Zelensky is trying to make the possibility of this failing and this falling through a loser for Donald Trump. He knows that Donald Trump cares about his image. He knows that he's a big branding guy. And Zelensky also knows that when Joe Biden's polling started to go down in the United States, it was after the Afghanistan withdrawal. The thing that the vast majority of Americans had been asking for a while was to bring our boys back from Afghanistan. He delivers it, but because of the mess of how it was done, because of the ISIS attack done during it, he didn't really get any political credit. In fact, it was a political loser for him even though the ultimate decision to go ahead with it will probably, in the long run in American history, I think viewed fondly, at least from the perspective of Washington. Maybe not so much from the perspective of women's rights in Kabul, its own tragedy, but that was the beginning of the end for Biden, polling-wise. Zelensky compares blocking of Ukraine's NATO accession to withdraw from Afghanistan. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukraine's possible membership in NATO should not be excluded from peace talks under threat of repeating the tragedy of the Afghan scenario when the United States quickly abandoned the country. I don't think anyone is, and this is the quote, I don't think anyone is interested in Afghanistan 2.0. It would be wrong. Maybe it's not quite comparable to Afghanistan, but disrespect for human life led to tragedy there. The president added that we remember what happened in Afghanistan when the Americans left in a hurry. He noted that there are enough examples of what happens when, and I quote, someone finishes something without thinking it through and leaves too quickly. Basically, he's saying that America's got a record of poor pull-out game, and they risk a repeat of behaviors if we just try to wrap this up with a bow before we have a solid foundation for it. And the thing is, if Trump does that and it does fall through, it's not only going to be bad for us geopolitically, it's not only going to be bad for us, our deterrence, it's not only going to be bad for our credibility, it's not only going to be bad for the Ukrainians, it's not only going to be bad for their civil society, for their civilians, and European economic stability, it's not only going to be bad for the future of American defense spending, it's also likely to be bad with the majority of Americans. See, the majority of Americans still view Russia unfavorably. Only 8% of Americans have a favorable view of Russia. Putin is still immensely unpopular. The invasion of Ukraine is still immensely unpopular. Now, we have about 40% of Americans who think that we're providing too much aid to Ukraine. But we also have 52% of Americans who think that American weapons striking deep inside Russia, so that means American missiles fired from Ukraine, firing into Russia, should be allowed. Just a slight majority. So a majority of Americans, it is not as dominant as it used to be at the start of the invasion, when it was like 72%. But a slight majority of Americans want to continue to maintain aid to Ukraine. A slight majority. I don't even know, because if I say 52% is a slight majority, then I would say a majority, like 57%, right? A majority of Americans want to continue aid to Ukraine. A slight majority of Americans, or half, if we're going to talk about the margin of error, believe that American weapons should be fired into Russia and would comparably be a stronger position than Trump's, again, relative, weaker position on the issue of long-range strikes into Russia, which is a weaker position than the Biden one. Pally, thank you so much for the primer. I appreciate that. And if Donald Trump negotiates over the head of the Ukrainians and makes a bad deal and essentially surrenders Ukrainian territory and gets nothing for their side and does a bad deal for them when Ukraine still pulls quite favorably, Russia still pours quite unfavorably, considering his record and the branding of him being a Russia stooge in the past. I mean, it could really be a branding disaster. I do think part of the reason why Donald Trump didn't remove sanctions on Vladimir Putin, here's the polling, by the way, they're 52 to 43% of a clear majority of Americans. Well, see, I said 52% of Americans. I wasn't even making the point that it's like a 10% difference between support and oppose. My goodness. The era of nuclear nonproliferation is ending. That is a risk. Thank you so much for the $2. I appreciate that. That is a risk. But again, if Trump makes a deal that is too bad to the Ukrainians, it will hurt him. The majority of Americans still support Ukraine. If Trump makes a deal that leads to a war again in 2 years or 3 years or down the line, I think it will hurt him. Now, if he waits long enough that an office and the political consequences will not affect him, then maybe he was able to salvage himself politically in the short term. And that's the one fear I have, is that just the negative side effects of Trump's implementation of policy on Ukraine is not going to be felt until he is gone, therefore not punishing him duly. for his bad policymaking on the matter. Either way, though, Americans want a good deal for the Ukrainians. They don't want the Ukrainians to be sold out. And the American public is still stronger on Trump on the issue of Ukraine. So Trump, considering he still has a barely positive approval rating right now, or a plurality, he has a barely positive plurality, or at least 50-50 approval rating right now, and we're just in February still, he does not want to start by immediately kicking the edge of a table, stubbing his foot on the Ukraine issue. So there is a motivation against Trump completely selling the Ukrainians out. But on principle, I think he would do it in a heartbeat if he thought he could benefit himself. There might be people like this, and I remember when I was in Ukraine talking to my fixer about the war, talking about the Republican Party, because he was a conservative man, my fixer. He's quite conservative. He's a Christian man. Protestant, was brought up that way. He believes in Protestant values, very traditional. And so when he talks to Republicans, when he talks about family values, when he talks about, issues of gender or LGBT, he generally is more in their corner. And his hope, and the hope of a lot of people, either who were of that ilk or maybe were more like of the rolling of the dice, is that these types of Republicans, like Roger Wicker, the Republican senator who is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, would outnumber the amount of Republicans that would be willing to sell out. And not only that, but that they would be bold enough to stand up to Trump in that situation. Because not all Republicans are like that. The problem is Roger Wicker can say stuff like this. Let me say this from Roger Wicker. No, Putin is a war criminal. This is asked if he thinks Russian President Putin can be trusted during negotiations. His response was no. Putin is a war criminal who should be in jail for the rest of his life, if not executed. Strong words. You go in the replies, you see a lot of Ukrainians like, whoa, yeah, they're still good Republicans. And this language is great. Use your legislative power to assert your authority over our diplomatic endeavors. Work with your Democratic colleagues to pass bills that will ensure aid continues to flow to Ukraine, and assert your power of the purse to make sure that he can't unconstitutionally block it, like he's done in the past, like he did during his first term, and then like he's using Elon Musk through the Treasury Department and others to do now in his second term on a more broader basis over a whole host of issues. My goodness. If you guys wanted to see how Zelensky was reacting to all of this, would you be surprised to hear that he wasn't in the jolliest of jolly tones? That he didn't exactly sound like a Keebler elf at the moment. Let me read you some statements from his recent diplomatic visit. I will not travel to Saudi Arabia tomorrow. We have postponed the visit to March 10th, and we expect the U.S. representatives in Kiev. I care about what our partners think of us. We are absolutely honest and open. This is why I will not go there. The U.S.-Russia meeting in Saudi Arabia was a surprise to us. We were not invited. I do not know who will stay there in Saudi Arabia and who will leave. Europe, NATO, and the United States could give Ukraine hope for strong security guarantees and NATO membership, but we do not hear such support from the United States. The United States and Europe do not support Ukraine and NATO membership. I believe this aligns with Russia's strong desire, and it matches this outcome. He's saying that Europe and the U.S. currently do not support Ukrainian membership, and this is supporting Russia's outcome, their desired outcome. None of the players negotiating about Ukraine are talking about the return of prisoners. And this is something I've been talking about, at least on this channel, is that when you don't have Zelensky at the table, and you just have Trump and Putin, when is Trump going to say, hey, remember all those children that was kidnapped from Kherson? Hey, remember all those people who were made prisoners at Azovstal that are still detained, and some of which have been given crazy long prison sentences? Hey, and all those people who are being tortured in the prison system, and for every day that they remain in Russian captivity is another beating inflicted, another electrocution done, another sexual abuse done against these prisoners. Hey, what about any number of these? What about the human safari? And these details are not going to be brought up or as prominent. It's going to be the bigger hot button bullet point issues that get the headlines, not the issues that actually matter to the people on the ground that Trump says he's supposedly trying to save. What is the point? Last quote from Zelensky. What is the point of saying empty words about how people should not die when thousands need to be brought back from Russian captivity. My goodness.